Welcome to part 2 of this Blender tutorial where we're creating these 3 procedural desert rock materials in Blender. So if you haven't seen part 1, then definitely check that out with the link in the description. And in part 1 we did all the 3D setup and we created the first procedural rock material. And so in this part we're going to be creating the 2 other procedural rock materials. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase these materials, you can do that on my Gumroad and my Patreon. The links are in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack to purchase all of my materials. Alright, so let's now create the second desert rock material. So I'm going to bring the camera view over here to the next objects. I'll select the object, let's click on it new to add a new material, and I can rename this Desert Rock 2. And then I will click and drag, and I'm going to drop the material on this object as well. So they both have the same material. And then just like we did with the other material, if I open up the side panel here, I want to go to the material properties and I'm going to go to the settings surface, and here on the displacement I want to change this to displacement and bump, and this way that material can use the displacements. So let's make this smaller. So to start off with this material, I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, and let's drop this here. And then I will Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it on the object. Also with the Voronoi selected, I'll press Control T to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and I want to use the object coordinates, so let's put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. And let's also turn the scale up on the Voronoi because I want to be able to see many of those little dots. So I'm going to turn the scale to about 350. Now to make the texture look more like desert rock, I want to kind of squish it down on the Z-axis, and that way it'll look a bit stretched back and forth. So I'm going to click on this mapping node, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here after the Voronoi, and I can drag the principled shader down there out of the way. So the first mapping node can be used to change the entire size of the material, but the second mapping node we can now use to stretch the texture. So here on the scale here on this second mapping, I want to take the Z scale and I want to turn this to a 1.5, and now you can see it's a bit stretched going up and down. Now if I zoom way into the texture, you can see all the little dots, but they don't have very much detail. And so I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, I'm going to search for a noise texture, and I'm going to put the noise texture in between the Voronoi and the mapping. And because it's going through the vector, this noise texture is now going to distort the placement of the Voronoi. So you can see it looks more noisy. And then let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale up to 16, and I also want it to be very detailed, so I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, but I want there to be a little bit less roughness just so that there's not quite as much detail. So let's turn the roughness here to just a 0.45. Now if I zoom way into this texture, you can see it's very distorted, and I want the noise texture to have less of an effect over the Voronoi. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to add a mix color, and let's drop it in between the noise texture and the Voronoi. Now I want to actually use the noise texture factor, so I'm going to unplug the color, and then I'm going to take the factor and I'm going to put that into color B on the mix. Then I want to take the original mapping, so this second mapping here, and I want to put the vector into color A. So now I can take the factor and I can drag it back and forth, and if I turn it up then it's going to distort it more and more. I'm also going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to linear light instead, and this way if I drag around the factor it's still going to distort it, but it's not going to move the texture around quite as much. So I can just turn this down a bit, and I'm actually going to turn the factor to like a 0.1, so now you can still see the Voronoi texture, but it looks somewhat distorted. So I now want to add another Voronoi texture, so I'm going to bring this Voronoi texture up a bit, and then I'm going to press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D is going to duplicate the node, but it's going to keep the wires plugged up. And I can just bring these here, so the linear light is going to be going into both of them. And I can Control Shift and select this bottom Voronoi texture to preview it. Now for this one, I want to make some big chunks with some little cracks. So what I'm going to do is click on the F1 here, and I'm going to change this to distance to edge. So this way, now if I zoom in, you can see there are some big white chunks with some little black cracks. Now this is way too small, so I'm going to turn the scale to like a 4 on this bottom Voronoi texture, and now you can see that those chunks are much bigger. So I now want to mix both of these Voronoi textures together. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to add another mix color. Let's just drop this here. Now I want to take the top Voronoi distance and I want to put that into the factor, and that's going to determine where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B. Then on this Voronoi texture here, the bottom one, I'm going to put the distance into color B. So I can now control shift and select the mix to preview it. So you can now see it's blending them together. And now if I take color A, I can make that lighter or darker, and I want to make it kind of a mid-gray color so you can see both textures. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using on value A, then you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 6A, 6A, 6A. So just like a nice mid-gray color. So now you can see we've mixed both Voronois together. So I now want to create the colors for the rock. So I'll select the mix node, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here. And then I want to take the mix result and I'm going to put that into the factor of this mix. So now here on color A and color B, we can make the two colors. So I'm going to first take color A and I'm going to make this brighter, and then I'm going to make it kind of like an orangey color for the desert rock. And then here on color B, I want to make this a brown color, so I'm going to make it orange and I'm going to make it darker, but then I want to make it slightly red, so I'm going to bring it over here towards the red, so it's kind of like a dark brownish red. And if you want to use the same exact colors I'm using, then here on color A, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in FF 9C62. And then if you want to use the same color for color B, the hex value that I'm using is 5A1912. Now if you take a look at the object, you can see it's mostly just showing color A, and it's very subtle to see color B. So I want to make it more contrasty. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's put the color ramp in between the two mix nodes. So we can now use the color ramp to make it more contrasty. So I'm first going to flip the values. So I'm going to bring the white tab over here almost to the very end, just right about there, and then I'm going to drag the black tab over to kind of about here. So this way now most of it is that lighter color, but you can see the dark color in that other detailed texture. So I now want to add more noise to the material, so what I'm going to do is add a new texture right up here. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'm going to search for a noise texture and drop this up here, and let's take this mapping node here, we'll put the vector into the vector of the noise texture, and I can control Shift and select it to preview it. And let's change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to a 19 so you can see more of it. I'll also turn the detail to the max of 15, and I'm going to turn the roughness to like a 0.7 so you can see more detail. Now I want to make this more contrasty, so I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's drop the color ramp here after the noise texture. And to make it more contrasty, we can drag this white tab out, and I'm going to drag the white tab to about here, so it's mostly white, but then there's just a little bit of gray. So I now want to mix this texture into the base color. So I'm going to select this mix here, this mix node, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it up here. And I'm going to take this mix right here with these two colors, and I'm going to put the result into color A. Then I want to take this color ramp over here and I'm going to put the color into the factor. So now if I control Shift and select this mix node, I can drag it down here and you can see it's mixing in a bunch of noise. Now I want to change this color, so I'm going to click on color B and I'm going to make this more of a brown color, so not quite as red, and I'm going to make it a bit brighter. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, then here on color B, you can punch in 673921. So now you can see it looks much more brown and noisy. Now if I control Shift and select this mix node right here, you can see we have these lighter colored chunks, and I want those lighter colored chunks to be lighter because they're going to be popping out in the final material. So I'm going to control Shift and select this mix, and then I want to click on the mix, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop another mix right here after the other two. So then what I want to do is take this bottom Voronoi texture, and I'm going to take the distance, and I'm going to put that into the factor of the third mix. And then this mix here, that can go into color A. So now here on color B, this can be the lighter color. So I'm going to click on color B, and I'm going to make it a much lighter color and more of a yellow color. And the hex value for this third mix on color B, this is going to be a hex value of FF8F54. Now you can see it's not very contrasty, it's kind of hard to tell where it is. So what I'm going to do is click on this color ramp, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it in between this bottom Voronoi texture and this last mix. So just drop it there in the wire. When the wire is highlighted, just drop it there and it's going to mix it in. And I can drag the color ramp right up here just so that we can see it a bit better. And then I want to be able to control where you can see those lighter colors. So I'm going to click on the black tab and drag it out a bit. I can also drag the white tab over over a bit to about here. Then I'm going to hold down the control key and click here in the black area to add another black tab, and I'm going to drag this one over here. So you can see we're basically taking away these values here by making this black, and we're taking away these values here, so we only have that lighter part which is right there on the tops. But then I want this to be a bit less strong, so I'm going to click on the white tab and I'm going to click on the color here, and I'm going to make this a little bit more of a gray color so it's not quite as strong. And the gray color that I'm going to be using, if you go to the hex value, you can punch in A2, A2, A2. And then I'm going to play around with this a little bit more, so I think I'll drag the white tab about there, maybe bring the black tab over a little bit, and maybe drag this back a bit. So something like that's pretty good. And then also if I go here to this mix, I just want to add the light values from this texture here. So I'll control shift and select the mix again. So I'm going to click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to lighten, and that way it'll just add the light values. So that is the final base color. So I'm going to drag the material output back, and I can take the principled shader, and I'm going to stick this in between the lighten and the material output. So the lighten can go into the base color of the final material. So I now want to change the roughness of the material, because you can see right now it doesn't look very much like rock because it's a bit too shiny. So I'm going to take this mix right here, this one has the gray value, and I'm going to take the result and I'll put that into the roughness, and this way some parts will be more rough and other parts will be more shiny. Now I want to have better control over that, so I'm going to click on this color ramp here, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here before the roughness. And then with the color ramp selected, I'll hit the backspace to reset the color ramp. Now if you make the values lighter, they're going to be more rough, so if I click on the color ramp black tab, click on the color, I can make this lighter, and now it's going to be much more rough, kind of like a dry rock. And the hex value that I'll be using for this light gray will be C6, C6, C6. Now later on when we create the custom node group, I want to be able to control the roughness, so I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'm going to add the hue saturation value node, and I'll drop this between the color ramp and the roughness. So this value, if I control Shift and select it to preview it, the value is going to make it lighter or darker, and if it's lighter or darker, that's going to make it more rough or more shiny. So I'll control Shift and select the principled shader, so we can use this value later in the custom node group. Now I also want to add both of these Voronoi textures into the bump strength. So I'll take the bottom distance on the Voronoi, and I'm going to put that into the normal, but then you can see there's some weird shading issues. That's because we need to convert this to normal data that the shader can use. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'll search for the bump node, and let's put that in between the Voronoi and the principled shader. And I actually want the Voronoi distance to be going into the height value. So now you can see it looks nice and bumpy. Now that's actually a bit too strong, so I'm going to turn the strength on the bump just down to like a 0.2. So now it's not quite as strong. Now I want to add this other Voronoi texture here, so I'm going to click on the bump, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here after the first one. So this way I can take this Voronoi texture distance, and we're going to put that into the height value of the next bump. And this way we can mix multiple bump maps together. So the first bump map is just going to make those big chunks, and then the second bump is going to add that little detail. And I want the second bump to be not quite as strong, so on the second bump strength here, I'll just turn it to like a 0.1. But I can now control Shift and select the principled shader, and you can see we now have a nice rock texture. Now the last thing that I want to do is add the displacements. So this Voronoi texture right here, if I control Shift and select it, this is the big chunks with the little cracks. So I want to put this into the displacement. So let's take the Voronoi texture distance, let's put that into the displacement of the material output, and then I can control Shift and select the principled shader. Now we need to convert it to proper displacement data, so I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the displacement node, and we're going to drop the displacement node here before it goes into the displacement on the material output, and I can drag the displacement down here. Now you can see the wires are overlapping, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over this wire and let go. That's going to add a reroute, and then I can drag the reroute over, and that's totally optional, but I just like to do that to keep my nodes nicely organized. Now you can see that it's not working correctly, and that's because we need to take the Voronoi distance and we need to put that into the height value of the displacement. And now you can see it's displacing the mesh. Now for some reason it's not displacing the mesh, then you need to make sure you're in the cycles rendering engine. So right here on the render properties, make sure you're using cycles because Eevee doesn't support displacements. And then also if you click here on the material properties, If you go to the settings under surface, you want to change the displacement to displacement and bump, and that way it's telling the material that it can use the displacements. So let's just minimize the side panel so we have more space. Now you can see this is way too strong, so I want to make it much more subtle. So we can turn the scale down to make it less strong. And I'm going to turn the scale to a 0.04, so it's not quite as strong. Now if I zoom in here, you can see that on this rock object, the mesh is kind of overlapping, and if I try to change this with the scale, it's not really helping that much. If I turn the scale down to 0, you can see it fixes that problem, but then there actually isn't any displacement because the scale is 0. So I'm going to turn the scale back to a 0.04. So to fix this, I can just turn the mid-level down to 0. And if I turn it down to 0, now you can see that it's actually popping out of the mesh. And there we have it. So there is the second desert rock material. So I'm now going to join this together into a custom node group. So I'm going to click and drag just to box select all these nodes, and then I can press Ctrl G. Ctrl G is going to join it together into a node group. And you can press the tab key to go in and out of the node group. So I'm going to drag the node group over here. Let's drag the material output over here. Then I can zoom in, and I want to click and drag to make this a bit bigger. And then if I click on the desert rock, I can press Ctrl C to copy the name. I can click here on the node group and press Ctrl V to paste that name. And then with this selected, I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group. Now if I press the N key to open up the side panel, I can click here on the group tab, and we have inputs and outputs. So right here on the BSDF, I'm going to double click on this, and I'm just going to rename it to shader because I think that looks a bit better on the custom node group. So we can now add all the customizable values into the input. So let's go over here to the group input, and I'm going to drag this down here under the texture coordinate. So I'm first going to take this first mapping, and I'm going to take the scale, and I'm going to put that into the extra socket here, and you can see now it says scale. And if I click on the scale, I want to take the type here, and I want to change it to float instead so that it's one single value. And then I need to change the default value back to 1, and then if I tab to go out of the node group, I want to change the scale back to 1. And now this can change the size of the entire material. So let's go back into the node group. So I now want to add the colors, so I'll click on the group input, and I'm going to drag this over here. I'm going to drag it over to the mix, and then I can take A, and I can put this into the extra socket. Also B, I'll put that into the extra socket, and then this one here, I'll take B, put that into the extra socket, and finally this last one here, put that to the extra socket. And then I'm just going to go through and name all these, so I'm going to name these colors 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the last one here, color 4. So now if I go out of the node group, we have the 4 different colors that we can change. Now I'm also going to click on the group input, and I'm going to drag it back over here because I want to add the noise scale. So let's take this noise texture here. If I drag the scale, you can see that's going to change the scale of the noise. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket here, and then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to noise scale. Now I also want to be able to control the size of those chunks. So right here, if we go to the bottom Voronoi, this scale here, that's going to change the size of those big chunks. So I'm going to take the bottom Voronoi scale, I'll put that into the extra socket, and then I can just rename this. And I'll rename this one to chunks scale. Now I also want to be able to control the detail. So let's take this Voronoi texture here. You can see there's this detail value here. So I'll put the detail into the extra socket, and I can rename this to noise detail 1. And then we also have this roughness value, and you can see if I turn this down, it's going to make it more detailed. So I'll put the roughness into the extra socket. And then this one, I'm going to rename to noise detail 2. Now another cool value that we can add is the linear light factor. So if I drag this factor around, you can see it's going to distort it more and more. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket here, and I can rename this one to distortion. And then I want to also add the roughness, so I'm going to drag the group input down here, and we have the hue saturation value. So let's put the value into the extra socket, and I can click on this, and I'm going to rename this one to roughness. And then I also want to be able to control the bump strengths. So let's take this first bump strength, I'll put that into the extra socket, and this one is the noise, so I'm going to rename this one to noise bump strength. So that's the noise. This second bump here is just the little bits of detail. So let's put the bump strength here into the extra socket, and I'm going to rename this second one to detail bump strength. And then finally, we just have the displacement strength. So I'm going to drag the group input over here, and let's take the scale of the displacement, I'll put that right in there into the extra socket, and I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to displacement strength. And I can click on the group input, and I'm going to drag it back here. I'm just going to drag it underneath the texture coordinate, and I will hit the tab key to go out of the node group, and I'll press the N key to close the side panel. And there is the Desert Rock 2 material. So we have the overall scale, and then we also have the different colors. So we have colors 1 through 4. Then we also have the noise scale. We also have the chunk scale, and then we have 2 levels of detail. So noise detail 1 and also noise detail 2. We also have the distortion and the roughness and the bump strengths, and then we also have the displacement strength. Alright, so now let's create the last desert rock procedural material. So I'm going to go over here to the other objects. I'm going to click on the object. I'll click on new to add a new material, and I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drop this material onto this object as well so they have the same material. And then I can just rename this to Desert Rock 3. Now, just like with the other materials, I want to use the material displacements. So if you open up the side panel here, make sure you are using the Cycles rendering engine to use the displacements, and also go down here to the material properties, and under the settings surface, you want to set the displacement to displacement and bump so that that material can use the displacements. And we can find the principled shader. So to create this material, I'll start by pressing Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and I'll search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here, and then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. I'm also going to press Control T with the Voronoi texture selected to add the texture coordinate and mapping, and I'm going to use the object coordinate, so I'll put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates will place the texture on the object more evenly. And then here on the Voronoi texture, I want to change this bottom value right here, so I'm going to change this to the Chebyshev. And now if I turn the scale up, you can see it's basically making these little square shapes. And here on the scale, I'm going to turn the scale to 16. Now, just like I've done with the other textures, I want to squish down the texture a bit so that it has that kind of desert rock texture. So I'm going to click on the mapping. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here after the first one. So the first mapping will control the entire size of the material, but this second one here, we can use this to squish down the texture. So on the scale Z here, I'm going to turn this to a 1.4 just so that it's squished down a little bit. Now I want to add a noise texture in between the mapping and the Voronoi to distort the texture. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'll search for a noise texture, and let's drop this between the mapping and the Voronoi. And I need to drag the principled shader over here to get it out of the way. And then let's change some of the noise texture settings. So here in the 3D, I'm going to change this to 4D instead. And then I'm going to turn the scale up, and I'm going to turn the scale up to 18. And then I'll turn the detail all the way to 15 so it's very detailed, and to give it a bit more roughness, I'll turn the roughness to a 0.55. So now it's very detailed. Now this is distorting the Voronoi texture a lot, and so I want to make the noise texture have less of an effect over the Voronoi. So I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to add the mix color. And let's drop the mix color in between the noise and the Voronoi. Now I want the noise texture color to be going into a value B, so let's put that into value B, and then we want this original mapping, which isn't distorted at all, we want that to be going into color A. So now if we drag the factor, if it's all the way at 0, it's not being distorted at all, and then as I turn it up, it's being more and more distorted. Now you can see when I do this, it's moving the texture around a lot. So let's click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to linear light instead. This way it's just going to distort the texture, but it won't move it around quite as much. And then I'll just turn the factor to like a 0.1 so it's not quite as distorted. So now we have that nice texture. So I now want to add a texture of some waves going along the rock. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the wave texture, and let's drop it above the noise. And then I want the same mapping vector to be going into the vector, the wave texture, and I'm going to Control Shift and select the wave texture to preview it. And let's change some of the settings. So on the X here, I want to change this to Z instead, so they're going back and forth. I also want to turn the scale up a bit, so I'll turn the scale to 6. Now the lines are very smooth, so I'm going to turn up the distortion to make it so they're a bit wobbly. So I'll turn the distortion to like an 8. And then I do want it to be very detailed, so I'll turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And this detail scale, I'm going to turn this to 2 so there's a bit more detail. And the detail roughness, I do want to turn this up a bit, so I'm going to turn it up to like a 0.62, so it's a bit more detailed. So I now want to mix this wave texture with this Voronoi texture. So I'm going to select the linear light, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it here. And if I click on the linear light, I just want to add the dark values. So let's change this to darken instead. And then I can take the wave texture color and I'm going to put that into color B. And then this Voronoi texture distance is going to go into color A. So we can Control Shift and select the darken to preview it. And then I want to add all of the dark values. So let's turn the factor all the way up to 1. So it's just adding the dark values of the wave texture. So I now want to create the colors for the texture. So I'll select the darken, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it here after the first one. And I want to click on the darken, and I want to change it back to the default of mix. And then I want this result here to be going into the factor. So this way, this white and black texture, because it's going into the factor, it's determining where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B on the object. So now let's make the colors of the rock. So for color A, I'm going to make this kind of a brighter color and kind of like a tannish peachy color, a bit orange. And the hex value that I'm going to be using for color A is going to be a hex value of D4, 89-4D. So you can punch that in if you want to use the same exact color I'm using. And then here on color B, I want to make this a reddish brown color. So I'm going to make it kind of orange and then kind of bring it over to the red, and then I'll make it quite a bit darker. And the hex value that I'm using for color B is going to be 4D, 1D, 1-3. Now I also want to mix this Voronoi texture into the texture again to give it a bit more detail. And also I want to break up the texture because right now you can see those waves really well. So I'm going to click on the mix, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here. So now we have a third one. And I want to take this Voronoi distance and I'm going to put that into the factor of this other mix. Then I want this mix right here, which has the two main colors. I want that to be going into color A. So now we can take color B and we can change that for the third color. And the hex value that I'll be using for this color B is going to be 3D, 160D. So you can see now it breaks up the texture and so it looks much more random now. So we can now add this to the base color. So let's take the principled shader and I can drop this between the mix and the material output. So that is the basic rock texture. So I now want to add some data into the roughness so that some parts are more shiny and other parts are more rough, but overall I do want it to be pretty rough because it's a dry rock texture. So let's click and drag to box select these two nodes and drag them back. And I want to take the mixed result and I want to put that into the roughness. Now I want to have more control over this. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'll search for a color ramp and I'm going to put the color ramp between the mix and the roughness. And then I want to flip these two values because right now the rock looks really shiny and wet. So I'm going to drag the black tab here and then I'll drag the white tab over here. And then if I make the colors lighter, they're going to be more rough. So I'm going to click on the black tab color and I'm going to make this much lighter and you can see now it's going to be much more rough. And the exact light gray color that I'm using on this color ramp is going to be a hex value of BC, BC, BC. Now later on when we join this together into a custom node group, I want to be able to control the roughness. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'll search for a hue saturation value and let's drop that between the color ramp and the principled shader. And then this value is going to make it lighter or darker, and so we can use this later in the custom node group to make the roughness more rough or more shiny. So this rock is very smooth, so I want to put some data into the normal to give it some bump. So I'm first going to take this noise texture here, and I'm going to take the factor of this noise texture. I'm going to drag this over and put it into the normal. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that's because we need to convert the noise texture data into normal data that the shader can use. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search. I'm going to search for a bump node, and let's drop this here in the wire. And we actually want the noise texture factor to be going into the height value of the bump. And that way it'll convert to normal data, so it looks very bumpy. Now we are going to be adding in displacements, and displacements will make it look very bumpy. So I'm going to turn the strength value way down to just like a 0.1. And that way there is just a little bit of surface detail, but we'll be using the displacements to give it more bump. Now I also want to add some bump to this, which is going to be some cracks. So I'm going to go over here to this wave texture and I'll press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D will duplicate the node, but it'll keep the wire plugged up. So I'll drop it here and then I can hold down the Control and Shift key and select the wave texture to preview it. So I'm going to make a texture with some cracks. So I'm going to turn the scale to a 4, and then I also want to make it much more distorted, so I'll turn the distortion all the way up to 20. And then all the other settings I'll leave at the default. Now I want to make these cracks much smaller, so I'm going to click on this color ramp, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it right here after the wave texture. And then with the color ramp selected, I can hit the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. Now to make the cracks much smaller, I can make it more contrasty. So I'll click on the white tab and I'm going to drag the white tab over, and I'm going to drag it pretty close, kind of to about here. And this way the cracks are very, very small. So I can now put this into the normal as well. So I'm going to click on this bump node. I'll press Shift D to duplicate. Let's stick it here after the first one. And the normal can go through the normal. So we can now take the color ramp color and let's put that into the height value of this extra bump. So this way, if I Control Shift and select the bump nodes, you can see we're mixing two bump maps together. And on this second bump here, I can turn the strength up so you can see it better. And here on the second bump strength, I'm actually going to turn this up to like a 0.6 so you can see the cracks much better. So now let's Control Shift and select the principled shader, and that is looking very cool. But I still want to add the displacements because right now it still is looking pretty smooth. So I'm going to take this darken right here, this darken result, I'm going to plug this into the displacement of the material output, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now just like we did with the bumps, we need to convert the color data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, I'm going to search for the displacement node, and let's put this here on the wire before the displacement, so just drop it there. And then I can drag this down to get it out of the way, and you can see this wire is overlapping, so just to organize the nodes better, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and right click and drag over the wire, and then let go. That's going to add a reroute, and I can bring the reroute over here just to make it a bit more organized. Now to convert this to proper normal data, we actually want the darken result to be going into the height value of the displacement. So just stick it in there. Now for some reason it's not popping out of the mesh, you need to make sure you're using cycles render because material displacements don't work in Blender Eevee, so make sure you're using cycles. And also here on the material properties under the settings surface of this material, you need to make sure the displacement is set to displacement and bump, and that's telling the material that it can use the displacements. Now it's way too strong right now, so let's make it much more subtle. So on the scale, I'm going to turn this way down to a 0.008. Now I actually want to invert the displacement texture because I want the parts which are going down in to actually be popping out. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm just going to search for an invert node, and let's stick this before the displacement height. So you can now see those waves are popping out instead of going back in. So this is looking pretty cool, but the surface of the rock isn't the exact shape that I want. So what I'm going to do is go back here to these textures, and I'll press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the RGB curves, and let's drop the first RGB curves in between this wave texture and the darken. So just drop it right here. So we can now use this RGB curves to change the shape of those waves. So I'm going to zoom in closely to the side of the texture so I can see this better. So I'm going to click to add a dot there, and let's drag this up here. Then I can click to add another dot in the center, and let's drag this down. And then I can click right here to add another dot, and I can drag this up. So basically this shape here is going to be the shape of those waves. And of course, if you wanted to make that stronger, you could go to the displacement scale and you could turn that up a bit so it is stronger. I'm going to leave it at a 0.008. Now I also want to add another RGB curves right here after the Voronoi texture. So I'll click on the RGB curves, I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I want to drop it in between the wire, which is going from the Voronoi distance into color A of the darken. So you can see as I drag this over, it highlights the wire. So I'm going to click right there. So I want the Voronoi distance to go into the color, and then the RGB curves color can go into color A of the darken. And I can drag the RGB curves right here, and maybe just drag this back just to organize this a bit better. So then with this RGB curve selected, I'll hit the backspace and that is going to reset it. So I'm going to click here to add a dot, and I'm going to drag this out, and you can see because I'm dragging this out, now it is going back in, and it's going back in instead of coming out because we inverted it. If I select the invert and then press the M key, that's going to mute it. So now you can see that part is going out instead, and it's reflecting the same shape as the RGB curves. I'm going to click on the invert though and press the M key to unmute that. So now back over here on the RGB curves, I want it to be going up a bit. So I'm going to click here to add another dot, and I'm going to drag this down, and that way these lighter parts are going to pop out a bit. So if I drag this over, it'll go back in, and then these lighter parts, if I drag this down, it'll pop out. And now you can see there's a lot more interest in the shape. Now that is a bit too strong, so I'm going to drag this back a bit. I'm actually going to drag this kind of to about here, and then this one right here, I'll kind of drag kind of into the center of that grid. So that is it. That is the finished procedural material. So I'm now going to join this together into a custom node group. So I'll click and drag just to box select all these nodes, except the material output, so all the other nodes. And I can press Ctrl G, and Ctrl G will join it together into a node group. Now if I press the N key, that's going to open up the side panel, and you can click on group and you can see there are inputs and outputs. And right here on the outputs, I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to shader because I like that better. And then if you hit the tab key with the node group selected, that's going to go in and out of the node group. So now you can see it's renamed to shader, and I'm going to click and drag to make this a bit longer. And also I need to click on the material output, and I'm going to drag this closer to make it look a bit nicer. And then also we can rename the node group. So if I click here on the material name, I'll press Ctrl C to copy that. I can click on the node group and press Ctrl V to paste that. So now it's renamed to Desert Rock 3. So then I will hit the tab key to go into the node group. So if I go right over here to the back, we have this group input here. And so we can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So I'm going to drag the group input down here, and I first want to change the overall scale. So we can take the first mapping scale, and let's put that here into the group input. And then if I click here on the scale, you can see that it has 3 different values, but I want it to just be one single value. So let's click on the type here, and I can change it to float instead. Now the default value, we want to turn this to 1 because that was the default values. And then if I tab to go out of the node group, I want to turn this scale back to 1. But you can see now this is changing the size of the entire material. So let's go back into the node group. So I now want to add all the different custom colors. So I'm going to drag the group input over here, drag it over here to the mix nodes. And I'm going to take this color here, color A, I'll put that into the extra socket. And here color B, put that into the extra socket. And then this mix here, this one, put that into the extra socket. And then if I click here, I can rename these. And I'm going to rename all of these to color 1 and also color 2. And then this one here, I'll rename to color 3. So I can now click on the group input, and I'm going to drag it back behind the other textures. So I now want to add all of the different scales of the textures because I want to control those different scale values. So I first want to add this noise scale. So let's put the scale into the extra socket. And I can click here to rename this, and I'll rename this to noise scale. Then I also want to be able to control the Voronoi scale. So let's put the scale here into the extra socket, and I can rename this to Voronoi scale. And then I want to be able to control the scale of the waves, so we can do that with this value here. So let's put the scale into the extra socket, and I can rename this one to wave scale. And then finally, I want to be able to control the crack scale. So this wave texture right here will control those little cracks. So let's put the scale into the extra socket here, and I can rename this one to crack scale. Then I want to be able to control the detail of the textures, and these textures here all have detail values, and they all have the same value of 15. So let's put the detail in here, and then we can take the detail from this noise, we'll put that into the same socket, and then this one here, we'll put the detail and put that into the same socket. So because they're all going into the same detail socket, it'll control all of them at once. And I can click on this to rename it, and I'm going to rename it to texture detail. Then I want to be able to control the roughness, so let's drag this group input down here, and we have this hue saturation value. So let's take the value, and I can put that in there, and then I can click on this, and I'll rename it to roughness. Then I want to be able to control the bump strength, so this first one here is the noise bump strength. So let's put this into the extra socket, and I can rename this to noise bump strength. And then I also want to be able to control the cracks bump strength, so that's this one here. So I can put this into the extra socket, and I'll rename this one to cracks bump strength. And then finally, I want to be able to control the displacement. So let's drag the group input over here, and I can take the displacement scale, I'll stick this in here, and then I can change this to displacement strength. And I can drag the group input right back here. I'll just stick it underneath the texture coordinate, and I'll press the N key to close the side panel and the tab key to go outside of the node group. And there we go. So there's the third material. So we have the overall scale, and we also have the different colors. And then we also have the noise scale and the Voronoi scale and the wave scale and the crack scale. We also have the overall texture detail. And then we have the roughness, and we have the different bump strengths. And finally, we have the displacement strength. So thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to help support this channel and purchase these materials, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And you can also check out my procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack. And my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're pre-set up in Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And you'll also get future updates with all of my new materials. Or if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching.